With arguably one of the deepest teams around the NBA, who's in and who's out of Erik Spoelstra's rotation? We debate the options and break down what De'Aaron Fox is doing in Sacramento on today's episode of Locked On Heat.
You are Locked On Heat, your daily Miami Heat podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome to Locked On Heat, your daily podcast on the Miami Heat. Whether you're tuning in on YouTube, Odyssey, or your favorite podcast app, thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. I'm Wes Goldberg, editor at allyoucanheat.com, here with David Ramil. Both of us are credentialed Heat media members who cover this team every day, and the best way to support the show is to leave a 5-star rating and review on your podcast app and join more than 14,000 Locked On Heat lifers by subscribing on YouTube. Today's episode is sponsored by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. We'll get to the De'Aaron Fox news here in a second, but now that we're 2 preseason games in and we've gotten a brief look at most of the Heat's roster, David, I thought we could project what we think the Heat's 10-man rotation is going to look like, and I think there's already been some surprises. But let's start with the starting lineup. We know what it's going to be. Terry Rozier, Tyler Hero, Jimmy Butler, Nikola Jovic, and Bam Adebayo. And Erik Spoelstra has made a conscious effort to get those 5 guys on the floor as much as possible in the preseason, kind of going to these line shift type of rotation patterns where all those 5 guys are in, and then he kind of goes into this bench unit that we're going to talk about here in a second. But just in general, what are your sort of thoughts, observations, anything that surprises you about what we've seen from that starting group so far?
Nothing really. I mean, we talked about it for most of the summer. Like, we debated the options at the power forward spot. There are still other possibilities. Even as we talked about it following the second preseason game against the New Orleans Pelicans, we still had some viewers that kind of believed that Haywood Highsmith might get a look at the power forward spot. But I think we've seen what Highsmith can do. We know his defense is going to be elite. We trust in his three-point shooting, although I don't know he's going to be able to duplicate the success of last year, but he's just too undersized. He's not a reliable option. And Erik Spoelstra has watched teams break down over the last few years, whether it's Bam Adebayo or Jimmy Butler or somebody else, because you've just got these undersized lineups and you're always trying to compensate for that. And that leads to additional wear and tear, which leads to breakdown and eventually leads to missing games in crucial moments during the season. You can't afford that. Rather go with size and try to avoid as much banging and wear and tear as possible in the hopes that you can have a healthy run throughout the regular season that can capitalize into a positive seed and avoid the play-in tournament, because we saw how that was a debacle for Miami last year, and then possibly go on another deep playoff run. But that's looking far ahead. So I'm not surprised at the starting lineup. I think it meshes well. You've got the complement of players there. We've seen what Terry and Tyler look like in game 1 for one half. Let's see if they can continue to duplicate it during this regular season. But I think that's going to be the starting lineup moving forward. And I wouldn't be surprised if it continues that way for most of the regular season, unless Nico has a really drastic turn where he slides completely from where he was last year.
Yeah, I think the Nikola Jovic part of this is the interesting part. It's sort of the wild card. I think that Erik Spoelstra is going to try to make Terry Rozier and Tyler Hero work. I don't know that there's anybody that's another option there that makes so much more sense, right? When we're talking about the Miami Heat, I think we need to keep the ceiling in mind here based on who the competition is in the Eastern Conference. And it's a loaded Boston Celtics team that are the favorites to repeat as champions. You've got a Sixers team that has reloaded with Paul George and everybody else that they have over there. The Knicks, everything that they've done over the offseason. Yes, maybe the starting lineup works better with Duncan Robinson in it, and if just maybe it flows better with Duncan Robinson in it right now. But the Heat have moved Tyler Hero into the starting lineup over the last 2 years because they believe that to hit this higher ceiling, they need Tyler Hero to work. And the floor of Miami's offense with Duncan Robinson is probably higher, and it looks better and all these things. But in terms of a ceiling, like winning a championship, they need somebody who's going to go out there and score 20-plus points a night. And Tyler Hero hasn't always done that efficiently, but he has been more consistent in terms of just putting points on the board than basically anybody else other than Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo on the entire team, and maybe even more than those guys at certain for stretches. So I think that's why you see Tyler in there. Terry just makes sense. He's kind of the only guy on the roster who does what he does. running pick and roll, getting to the basket, putting pressure on the rim, kicking out to shooters. And by the way, he's maybe been the guy I've been most impressed with through the first 2 preseason games. I love the effort he's giving on the defensive end. He's getting deflections, steals, blocks, like all these things. And I look at what he can do, and I love the role that he kind of played early on in his career with those Boston Celtics, where he was more of Scary Terry, who could go off for 25 points on any given night, but was always bringing it defensively and was doing those little things. And he is doing those little winning things that Erik Spoelstra always talks about in these first 2 preseason games. But you're right. We got to see it for more. I got to see like Tyler Hero embrace the off-ball stuff. Terry Rozier embrace the little things, not get bored with not scoring as much. All these things. It's easy to do when everybody's excited and buying in a preseason game when the competition isn't what it is. It's a little bit harder to do in January or February when maybe you're in a 4-game losing streak or something. So we'll see if these habits have really taken hold here. In terms of Nico, though, that's my biggest question is, can he hold on to that 4 spot? I do think Haywood Highsmith could be a potential replacement for him. I think that there's a reason why we saw him get like 2 or 3 minutes of run. And I think we'll see with the other 4 starters. And I think we'll see that again in this preseason. I think Jaime Jaquez Jr. definitely has the potential to earn that spot. That seems like if there's going to be a spot that changes, it's that one. Although Nico hasn't done any, I think it would be too quick right now to make that change. I do think that they owe it to themselves to see this Nico thing through for a little bit longer.
Yeah, you mentioned the ceiling. I think the team's ceiling is higher with Nico being able to stretch the floor, rebound, push the ball. He does a lot of things differently on offense than what Highsmith is capable of. So I absolutely agree. I think you could see options there. And you know, as we'll continue to talk about the rotation, I've separated it into tiers, and my second tier includes players who Erik Spoelstra has trusted as potential starters and will continue to do so moving forward. I don't know if you want to get into that already, but I mean, we've got the starters locked in. I think there's the possibility of maybe some changes during the course of the season. Obviously, the injury always changes everything. But as far as the next group of players that are going to be consistent parts of the rotation, I think those are guys that we've seen start in the past and that Erik Spoelstra trusts in those roles.
Yeah, I like that idea. We'll put a pin in it. But my last question for you excuse me, and start of the starting lineup is that platoon system, that lineup, that whole line shift change. I that feels to me like a preseason thing, but we could see pockets of games where the entire second unit is on the court. You mentioned in the cold open there, the Heat maybe might be one of the deepest teams in the league, and actually that you kind of surprised me with that. I was like, oh, you're kind of teasing me into our own episode here. Like, do you really think that the Heat are one of the deeper teams in the league?
I think obviously they're overlooked. I think, you know, everybody kind of sees that you don't have a top 10 player on the roster and maybe middling talent around Jimmy and Bam. And I think, you know, obviously people are down on what Tyler Hero and Terry Rozier can do. And there's the unknown question of Nikola Jovic's potential. But I mean, you've got really solid players that, again, quality starters that have all had playoff moments in the past, backing them up, and you've got other veteran players, you've got young players on this roster. It's a good mix. I mean, I don't think that there's any one position that's lacking other than maybe the point guard position, something we'll talk about as we get deeper into the rotation. But other than that, you look around, and I mean, I even in this exercise, I have like 12 players, maybe even 13 players that could qualify for extended minutes or some regular minutes here and there, and we haven't even seen one of them at all during the preseason. So I think you look at this group, and it's the question. The problem with this is that, again, you don't have that top tier player, which is what Miami's problem has been for the last couple of seasons. Like, Jimmy becomes that top tier player in the playoffs, but during the course of the regular season, he's not that guy. So when you look at Miami's depth, it's like, oh, okay, well, you've got a lot of good players that are like maybe 20 through 150 or 175 in terms of where they rank among the NBA's top players. But that's a lot of players, and that's why they're the deepest. They just don't have the highest ceiling, but they've got the highest floor.
The one other thing that I'll mention before we get out of here, the staggering that I think is probably going to happen more in the regular season is something I'm going to keep an eye on, and obviously has sort of this waterfall effect on the rest of the rotation, right? We're going to get into the backup point guard question here. Maybe the Heat don't even use one if they always have one of Tyler Hero or Terry Rozier on the floor. Maybe they still have one because they just don't want Tyler Hero being that lead guard anymore, that they just want him to be this off-ball guard, a real sort of traditional shooting guard the full time, right? And I think that's certainly an option. And the other stagger that you have to monitor too is Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo. Spoelstra has tended to keep one of those guys on the floor at all times. Does he still do that, or does he kind of like you believe in Miami's depth where they could survive 3, 4, maybe even 5 minutes at a time without one of those guys on the court, because they haven't been able to do that, which is why Spo separates
against New Orleans.
We did not, or against Charlotte, and so
right.
It is
no, we did it against Charlotte because he had that full line shift, right? I mean, where they took the starters out and then he brought the whole bench in, so neither Jimmy or Bam was out there. But against New Orleans, the first substitution was Jaime and Duncan in for Terry. No, was it for Tyler? It was for Tyler and Jimmy.
Tyler and Jimmy. Or Tyler and Nico. It was Tyler and Jimmy. But it's something to monitor, is the point. Let's move on to your tiers. I like that. That was an interesting idea. Who are the first 5 off the bench? What about Spo's tough decision about backup center? I think he's got something to figure out there. We talk about where things stand now and how it could change after this, next on Locked On Heat.
Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Excuse me. They've got a new feature called Gametime Picks. It makes getting tickets to see your favorite events even easier than ever before. If you want to watch a team play, you want to go to a comedy show, or you want to go to a concert, guess what? Gametime Picks filters out all the fluff, so you get only the incredible deals on great seats. You don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. No need to get frustrated. Buying tickets used to be fun. You just go get the tickets. Now it seems like a hassle every time you have to do it, and you worry about all these kind of fees cropping up. No. Gametime doesn't have that. They're all in pricing, makes it so simple. You know exactly what you're paying right away. You can see exactly where you're going to be sitting if you're going to a venue you're not familiar with, and they've got their lowest price guarantee, so they will credit you 110% of the difference. It's so convenient. You have to use Gametime. Take all the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime Picks. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA, and you get $20 off your first purchase. Even more reason to use Gametime. Terms do apply, but create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA, and you get $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? It's game time. We'll be right back.
Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. We want to invite you to the exclusive Locked On Heat Insider community. If you want to join, there's a link in the show notes on YouTube and in your podcast description. If you join, there's a bunch of cool stuff waiting for you, exclusive content, insider from us as we cover the games, game notes, stats while we're at these games, intel on moves and trades that could happen before the trade deadline, and best of all, the chance to talk to us one-on-one through the subtext messaging platform. You're going to get exclusive first dibs at mailbag questions, at sending those in. So you could sign up in the show notes. It's free for 14 days. After that, $4.99 a month. You can cancel at any time. No worries. Really excited to get this chance to connect with all of you. Hit me with those tiers.
Well, I've got 3 players in tier 2, and these are potential starters, guys that have started in the past, and guys that will be regular parts of the rotation moving forward. And in that, I've got Jaime Jaquez Jr., Duncan Robinson, and Haywood Highsmith. I think they're going to be your top 8. That's going to be rounding out your core, because you get staggered Tyler and Terry, but you need the shooting that Duncan provides, plus the versatility that he's been able to incorporate over the last season. You've got Jaime Jaquez, who can be a guy who fills in for Jimmy, brings that energy. He could play the 4, he could play the 3, do a number of things offensively. And then you've got Haywood Highsmith, your defensive stopper. He is a guy who they brought back for a reason. They signed him this offseason knowing that they believe in what he can do offensively, and they already know what he can do defensively. And so he's going to be a regular part of the rotation moving forward.
Yeah, I like how you're thinking about this. It's kind of interesting, right? Because Erik Spoelstra is going to go, he typically goes with 10 guys in a regular season game. And then you see that shorten in the playoffs when everybody's healthy, 8 guys, maybe even 7 guys. And I think if you do stagger the guards, Terry Rozier and Tyler Hero, you can afford to maybe just have one guy come off the bench, and that's Duncan Robinson in this situation, who can kind of play with either one of them. And then you've got Haywood Highsmith, who can play either forward position, and then Jaime Jaquez, ditto, right? Who could play either forward position and then helps kind of get that Jimmy Butler type of play when Jimmy Butler isn't in the game. You might need a center in that group. I guess you could potentially play like Nico as a backup 5, or
exactly,
or Haywood Highsmith even as a backup 5 at times. But I think you're right in terms of that if we're going to kind of do like a first 3 off the bench, that's probably it. Although I think during the regular season, certainly the Heat are going to play with at least one backup center there.
Right.
And then so that makes the next obvious name Kevin Love. Kevin Love through these first 2 preseason games has been Bam's backup. I think there's a rush to put Kel'el Ware in there, at least from the fan base, not from the organization. A rush to maybe just assume Kel'el Ware is going to take those backup 5 spots, or even Thomas Bryant, who was a little bit of a surprise that the Heat re-signed, but seeing that they re-signed him, like, oh, well, maybe he's going to play a role this year. Kevin Love still has that spot, and it feels like it's his to lose. It also feels like he could lose it, right? Because it hasn't been the most impressive thing. But he's not in midseason form either, right? Like, he might work himself into even better playing shape here, but there's no argument that he's getting older. We've seen him, even since he first joined Miami a year and a half ago, start to decline a little bit. And I think that's why Miami has addressed the position the way that they have, with drafting a guy with the 15th pick and then re-signing somebody who they were familiar with in Thomas Bryant, who you can knock Miami's plan of running it back the whole time. There wasn't a whole lot of awesome free agent centers out there this year. And so when you're just re-signing a guy, they're like, all right, we know this guy, we like him, just bring him back. So they have some options if the Kevin Love thing doesn't work out. And that's kind of why I was teasing before we went to that break there, David. I think there's a top 10 rotation now, and I think there's going to be a different top 10 rotation later. Yeah. And I think that's part of the plan, right? I don't think that would be a failure by what this first 10 is right now. I just think that there's guys who Erik Spoelstra trusts right now, but other guys who need to and maybe even project to earn that trust by March, April, that kind of part of the year. So right now it's Kevin Love, but I think by the end of the season, it could be Ware, it could be Thomas Bryant.
Yeah. The Love question is why I have him in my 3rd tier, and I've got him basically just a smidge above Thomas Bryant. Like my 3rd tier includes Alec Burks, Thomas Bryant, Kevin Love, and Drew Smith. And I could see any one of those guys getting some minutes on a game-to-game basis. And I think the Love question is something that we have to be honest about, because as much as we like the leadership, the off-the-court chemistry, and the floor spacing that he's still able to provide, the rebounding that he's been able to provide, the outlet passing, all the smart, high basketball IQ things that Kevin Love has been able to provide in the second phase of his career.
And the chemistry with Jimmy.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yep.
But I don't know how reliable those are. And you have to start asking those questions. You know, it doesn't feel fair to a guy who wants to play in Miami, who's re-signed, etc. But you have to start questioning how reliable he can be. And maybe you're right. Maybe he's not just in mid-season form yet, but he will be. He'll get into shape. He'll get that kind of shake that rust off by December, by January, and he'll have some good games here and there. But it's looked a little shaky in the preseason, and that doesn't necessarily bode well. It could turn around. It has before, but you don't want to count on that. And when you got a guy like Thomas Bryant, who basically is, a decade younger and provides a lot of the same things in terms of he's an active rebounder. He's a guy who can space the floor. He's got a lot more pop and athleticism around the rim than Kevin Love does. He's not a bad 3rd option to have, and one who could certainly leapfrog Kevin in the process of finalizing your top 10 rotation. So I don't know where they'll wind up, to your point. And yes, Kel'el Ware is certainly a possibility as well, although for my taste, I think he's still too far down. I don't think he's going to be rushed into this, because I think that would be more detrimental to trying to put him out there. I don't think he's ready. I don't think the Heat think he's ready. And as much as I'd like that to be, I was high on Kel'el Ware during the draft process. I thought, given his size and the potential and everything else, you had to take a chance, and Miami did take that chance. But that doesn't necessarily translate into anything. You can't take that risk and just kind of throw him out there at 19 years old, because we've seen it too often where a young player gets forced into this role and they don't adapt. And guess what? That blows up their confidence, and they never wind up rebounding, and they wind up having to go to another team to kind of they need a change of scenery, right? We hear that all the time around the trade deadline. We don't want Kel'el Ware to be that kind of player. So to me, he's not in that 3rd tier of guys that you could get consistent minutes with. What about Burks? Do you think he's going to be a guy who's going to be contesting for the occasional minutes? Because it just feels like he's so ignitable on offense, and we know how Spo loves those guys who can just come in, and you don't have to play him every game, but when you put him in there, he's good for like 10, 12 points a game.
It's a good question, right? Because I don't think he's your backup point guard, although certainly he's handled the ball in the past, but never really as a playmaker guy, right? He can run like a second side pick and roll, kind of be the second guy who touches the ball on an offensive possession and kind of make something happen. But generally it leads to his own shot.
Yeah.
Where Drew Smith, generally it leads to somebody else's spot. And we talked about Drew a little bit after the Pelicans game. I think, to me, he's probably closer to playing regular season minutes right now on a night-to-night basis than Alec Burks is. Alec Burks is, if Tyler Hero, Terry Rozier, or Duncan Robinson, if one of them is hurt for whatever reason, we now have Alec Burks. Where the Heat didn't have anybody like that last year, right? Like, they didn't really have that kind of option. And so they have that now. And by the way, that's the role that Alec Burks played in New York last year, and he was awesome at it. And sometimes you're just awesome at that one job, and you don't need to get Peter principled into doing something that you're not capable of doing anymore. And I think this is just where Alec Burks is in his career. Is he's that guy. He's a break glass in case of emergency, a fire extinguisher when you need a fire extinguisher. But you don't always need a fire extinguisher. So where Drew Smith, say what you will, I know a lot of people were surprised when the Heat brought him back in July on a two-way contract, and I get it. But you talked about people that Spo trusts. He trusts Drew Smith, right? Like, there's a reason this team, yes, they have waived him 4 times in the last 3 years, but the context around that is weird. One of the times they waived him was a plan, like he was a training camp invite, and they waived him to get him on the G League squad. So that doesn't really count. That's funneling your players into the G League program. The other times he did it is because he was on a two-way, and Miami was dealing with injuries. They were toggling between him and Orlando Smith. They waived Drew Smith twice. They waived Orlando Robinson twice, because they just needed a center at times, and sometimes they needed a guard. And then towards the end of last year, they had to waive him because obviously he was out for the season with the torn ACL. But they even kept him on the roster for a bit. But because the whole team was hurt all the time, they're like, we just can't afford to give a roster spot to somebody who's out for the year. So they waived him and figured out a way to sign Patty Mills. But then as soon as they got a chance, they let Patty Mills walk, and they brought back Drew Smith. So this is a team that has remained committed to Drew Smith, and I think they want to see that part of this through. And I do think that he's kind of, even though he's on a two-way contract right now, because Josh Richardson is out with his shoulder injury, and we don't know when he's going to come back, I do wonder, even if they stagger Terry Rozier and Tyler Hero, Drew Smith can play with either one of those guys. He's got pretty decent size. Defensively, he's a lot of what the Miami Heat are looking for. He had 7 deflections in that Pelicans game. Team high, 7 deflections. You know they love that stuff. Like, that's the stuff that Erik Spoelstra, the stuff that doesn't show up in the box score. That's what he's talking about. His assist-to-turnover ratio for his career, 4.5 assists to every 1 turnover. That's elite. That's Tyus Jones numbers. Granted, in an incredibly small sample size. He's played 24 NBA games, but the Heat want to give him a chance here. And so I think we're seeing that kind of play out, at least in the early portion of the season. Then when eventually Josh Richardson gets healthy, maybe he's somebody that is able to take over those backup point guard duties. Maybe there's another move to be made. Maybe they feel comfortable just with the 2 guards, with Terry Rozier and Tyler Hero basically doing it, and they feel like they don't need a traditional backup 1. But right now, it's Drew Smith.
Yeah, no, I all good points there. I've got Jay Rich in my 3rd and last tier, along with Pelle Larsson, who I think continues to push for that. But, he seems less likely. Right now, he's ahead of Richardson just because we don't know what Richardson's going to look like when he comes back. If Richardson comes back to the player he was last season, he'll probably get the nod in whatever minutes are left over. And Pelle will spend time in the G League so that he'll continue to develop and everything else like that, because he's a young player and he's just, a second-round draft pick, etc. And then I've got Khalil Ware rounding out that group as far as my last tier is concerned, because who knows, he might get some garbage time here and there, he might get some experience, and he might wind up leapfrogging Bryant or Love depending on how he continues to develop over the course of the regular season. But I think that basically, that closes the door to pretty much else. Everybody hoping for Keshad Johnson or Josh Christopher to getting more minutes. I just don't see it. I just don't see it.
And no Nasir Little either in that. And by the way,
I don't think he's going to make the roster.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything that you just said. Yeah, and that he's kind of that tryout guy. Let's move on. De'Aaron Fox. He's declining to sign an extension with the Sacramento Kings before the start of the season. What does this mean for Fox's future? Could he be the next whale for the Miami Heat? We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Heat.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans. You can start the season with a big return over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And it's #1 for many reasons. Sometimes you're watching a game and you know what? You get a hunch in the middle of the game. You want to check out the latest stats, or maybe you want to see the live play-by-play on another game. And there's so much more to do, and you can do it all on the same page where you place your bets. And right now, you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's just $5 and you get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed, but only when you go visit FanDuel.com. So go visit FanDuel.com today and get started on all the NFL action. We'll be right back.
Thanks again for making Locked On Heat your first listen of the day. Best way to support the show is to subscribe on YouTube. Follow us on your favorite podcast app. So it was reported by ESPN on Monday that De'Aaron Fox is declining to sign a max extension before the start of the season. So he's eligible for a 3-year, $165 million extension. Now, the way this is being framed, and I don't think it's wrong, I think this is actually what's going on here, is that De'Aaron Fox is waiting for next year when he can become eligible for an even more lucrative extension, either a 4-year, $229 million max, or if he makes an All-NBA team, which is entirely a realistic outcome for him, he would be eligible for that Supermax, which is 5 years, $345 million. So financially, it doesn't make a ton of sense for De'Aaron Fox to sign the extension now. It does make more sense for him to wait until next summer, as long as he's not worried about sort of the security of it all. But this is the sort of thing that opens the door for questions of, well, what is De'Aaron Fox's future in Sacramento? And I think there's a bunch of questions about the Sacramento Kings. I would argue they've, as fun as this run has been with them returning to the playoffs, and as good as De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis has been, and I think DeMar DeRozan is a very intriguing pickup for them over the summer, it feels like they've hit a ceiling. And I just don't really see the avenue, unless there's some sort of major shakeup trade, of them taking this core and getting back to the top of getting to the top of the Western Conference here. And so if De'Aaron Fox comes to that realization between now and next summer, maybe he looks around and says, well, I don't have a long-term extension, and I can kind of sign maybe not as lucrative of one anywhere else, but I could still get a max contract extension anywhere else I want. I'm that kind of player. Does he look around Sacramento and say, it's been a good run, but I'm going to request a trade to try to hit that next level? We've talked about De'Aaron Fox as a potential Heat target. There's a lot of things that make sense. He plays sort of the position that they've been chasing over the last few years. He averaged 26-plus points per game last year. He would be Miami's best scorer by a mile. He's clutch. There's the Kentucky connection with him and Bam. There's a lot of reasons to love De'Aaron Fox. But what are your thoughts on Fox as maybe the Heat's next star target?
And he strikes me as one of those guys who will say publicly he wants to build something here. He's already started the building. He was not going to leave until he gets it done. But that doesn't mean that he's married to the idea of staying in Sacramento throughout his career. Like, I could see him following a similar path to Damian Lillard. And I know that's going to bring up a lot of PTSD for Heat fans, but I just could see that, he wants to be a part of getting Sacramento and establishing a winning culture. Like, he's already helped develop it, and he's going to continue to develop it, obviously, this year. Who knows how much longer that will last, because that gets tiresome after a while when you win and you fall short, and you've got other teams. Like, you've got a young team in Oklahoma City that looks like they're going to be a clear title contender and probably many steps above where the Sacramento Kings are right now. So if you're looking at your competition out west, just to even be able to get to the Western Conference Finals or to get into the NBA Finals, you're probably not. It's not an easy path for Sacramento. So that's one. Two, I love De'Aaron Fox. I'm just also not convinced that he should be the player that Miami goes all in for. Like, we talked about this before we started recording. I'm a big fan of his and what he can do. You mentioned all the different factors that make him an attractive target for Miami. But having said all that, that commitment of money, that doesn't seem like the path for the Heat to take. Like, right now, they've got their own financial issues to concern themselves with regarding Jimmy Butler. And I don't know that they could start looking at what could be not necessarily a top 10 player and be like, we want to commit $300+ million to that player because we believe he's going to help us. Like, if you add De'Aaron Fox to this roster and replace Jimmy and probably one of either Hero or Rozier, is that a good enough team to contend against the Boston Celtics at their peak? I don't know. Like, again,
maybe
Boston's
not,
window,
but then
I
think you look at Fox, he's 26 years old. Bam is 26, 27.
Yes,
so,
the window.
And so the Celtics, they're not going to be able to keep that roster together. No. Somebody's got to go. And it might be multiple somebodies. Yeah, it might be multiple somebodies on that roster. And I think once that happens, Like Giannis is very quietly 30 years old, and Dame's not getting any younger either. Like that, I don't know what's going on. And that whole roster, by the way, Chris Middleton, that roster is aging out and might have already aged out. I don't know. We don't know for sure that this Knicks thing is going to work, and I don't think anybody looks at them as world beaters. I think after this year, I think the East gets back to being wide open. And if you've got a team with Erik Spoelstra, De'Aaron Fox, Jimmy Butler, and Bam Adebayo, despite whatever version of Jimmy Butler you get, then I think that team definitely competes. To your earlier question, like if Jimmy Butler walks because he's a free agent or whatever happens there, and it's only De'Aaron Fox and Bam Adebayo, that's at least young enough where you could start building around it, and hopefully you're not losing like these other core Jaime Jaquez type pieces and other first-round picks, Kel'el Ware type pieces where you can kind of reconstitute the roster in this younger image and kind of go for it a year or two from now. But I do hear you where De'Aaron Fox to me is always going to be like a perennial All-NBA candidate, right? He's going to be on your short list every year of, do I consider this guy for one of my All-NBA teams? And he's an awesome player, and he's clutch. And what he did in the playoffs 2 years ago against the Golden State Warriors with the broken finger, incredible. And it's the kind of thing that this Heat organization loves. And I think they would love to have a guy like De'Aaron Fox. And I covered him briefly earlier in his career when I used to go up to Sacramento and watch him as a rookie. And even then, he just had like this megawatt smile and big-time superstar personality. Like, he would thrive in Miami. That guy would thrive in Miami. The fact that he's thriving in Sacramento tells you that. But it's also fair to say, that's not Luka Doncic. That's not Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. He's not that guy. And that's kind of been the Heat's problem the whole time when they've even had Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo, is that Jimmy's only that guy for a couple of months. And we don't know that De'Aaron Fox has that ability to become that guy as impressive as he was in the playoffs, and if there's like a playoff De'Aaron Fox or something. So that's fair. The one thing I will want to bring up, though, is at the risk of completely reckless speculation here, okay? So this is not to be aggregated or anything like that. The Heat have bridged that working relationship with Clutch Sports. De'Aaron Fox is represented by Clutch Sports. And the Heat, if they have accomplished anything this summer, is that they've bridged that working relationship that otherwise did not seem to at least exist in the past. They signed Alec Burks, who is a Clutch Sports agent, the first guy they've signed with that agency since LeBron James left. And they used Clutch Sports to acquire their New Jersey patch and gave them a major shout out in the press release for that. So there is a working relationship on a lot of different levels now between the Miami Heat and Clutch Sports. And you do wonder, again, reckless speculation, if that's sort of opening the door for another client to come back or to come to Miami in the future where, hey, we're going to take care of you now. Maybe you take care of us later when all this stuff might possibly be happening.
Looking forward to Heat Insider says De'Aaron Fox Clutch looking to work their way to Miami, coming out within the next hour and a half after the show publishes. So congratulations.
Yeah, maybe. Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Like, comment, and subscribe on YouTube. Follow us on your favorite podcast app. We will be back tonight with our post-game reactions from the Heat's third preseason game. Until then, subscribe. Thanks for listening.